science of monitoring and evaluating impact can catch up with the technological ability to cross nature's frontiers.
But if you look at this particular example, there is a very minute part of this which seems to be affected, which is being mixed with a large amount of matter that is supposedly safe.
Well, Dan, I think it's like being a little bit pregnant. The issue about this is that there are consequences, and to pretend we can pursue science without consequences is actually bad science. What I think we need to do now is to recognize, first of all, that there are huge commercial repercussions which will follow today, and that is that as supermarkets and consumers queue up to turn their backs on GM crops, the farmers who in good faith have been growing GM-free crops suddenly discover that there are degrees of cross-pollination or contamination which will affect their ability to sell their goods. So I think the government has to step in here and provide a compensation framework for goods, for products that they can't sell, and a liability regime which will make the seed corporations fully responsible for all consequential financial loss or environmental or human health damage that follows as we discover it.
What about that, Brian, and the liability scheme and the compensation? Because that seems only fair, doesn't it, in this particular climate of distrust about GM food?
Well, I think we can discuss the concept of compensation. Alan's perhaps right there. We should have a discussion about it. But I think the important thing is to tighten up on the importation of seedstuffs. And this event is regrettable in the fact that we didn't have the legislation in place. And Alan's right, technology is going at a speed where legislation always lags behind. That will always be the case, it always has been the case.
But what about this particular case? I mean, is it dangerous, do you think?
No, absolutely safe. Nick Brown has taken advice from the right committees who give the independent advice. And as a chemist, I can assure the general public that the chemical content of the food oil, when this crop has been processed, will be 100% identical to any other rapeseed oil crop.
But how do you explain that when you look at the Board of Agriculture in Sweden, who had got the same sort of crop, and they are ordering farmers to destroy these crops?
Well, I think that's an over-the-top reaction, frankly. People are calling for that here, but I personally
But it plays
don't
to the fears of people in this country, doesn't it?
Well, it does, unfortunately, and I can understand people being concerned, and they're right to be concerned. But as a chemist who understands the chemistry of the processing of this particular crop, I'm convinced that we have 100% safety at the end of the process.
But doesn't it also demonstrate, this whole thing, that the government has very little control over the sort of quality of the seeds that come into this particular country?
Well, it does. You see, I mean, in a way, I want to side with Brian and say, you know, I respect and value the contributions he can make as a scientist. I just feel that we have to give some space for scientific measurement to catch up with technological change, and we're not doing that.
And who decides that?
Well, as a government, we have to set that framework in place, which is why I support Scandinavia, which is why I support Austria's decision to ban the growing of Chardon LL, another GM crop, and to put in a space within which science itself can develop different benchmarks to retain and restore its credibility. But in the meantime, you know, America, I think Brian's right to say, it's the importation of the grain. America now still will not allow the importation of UK beef. They are not satisfied that it is sufficiently safe for their public to consume beef products from the UK. If that's valid for them, then it has to be valid for us to say, then we will not accept the importation of grain which cannot be guaranteed as GM-free.
We'll leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed, Alan Simpson and Brian Edden. Well, William Hague arrived in Brighton this morning to deliver a hard-hitting speech of law and order to the Police Federation at their annual conference. And talking to a packed-out hall, he launched a fierce attack on the Liberal establishment, singling them out as the complacent establishment. He went on to blame their weakness at identifying crime and their inability to properly punish it, for increased crime and weaker sentencing.
Let me start by utterly rejecting the defeatist nonsense that says crime is just a function of economic and social trends. For that is the constant excuse of a complacent establishment. They talk of crime as an abstract concept, dismiss the victims as mere statistics on a page of a sociology thesis, and are always looking for someone other than criminals to blame for crime. And that liberal thinking on crime, which has pervaded our criminal justice system for 40 years, has comprehensively failed this country. Because over that period, the murder rate has doubled, violent crime has risen from 24,000 cases a year to 664,000, burglaries have gone up from 75,000 to nearly 1 million. The only period when crime has fallen consistently in the last 40 years was at the very end of the last government when Michael Howard was Home Secretary.
William Hague, and our political correspondent Nick Robinson joins us now, fresh back from Brighton. How did this play?
Played well, frankly, and one delegate said behind me as William Hague finished, what a difference a day makes. Jack Straw went yesterday, struggled hard to impress the Police Federation, ad-libbed a lot, slightly had an awkward delivery, I'm told there. William Hague, as ever, cracked a few jokes, pushed all the right buttons for the Police Federation, talked about more PCs, not more PC, political correctness, talked about red tape and bureaucracy, and the truth is they liked it much, much better than the Home Secretary's speech.
So it plays to the Tory heartland very much indeed. But is this meaning that the Conservative Party, in a sense, is becoming a single-issue party on law and order?
Well, it's something I put to William Hague. I bumped into him before the speech. He said, you're on about law and order again, aren't you? I thought you promised your party, because it's reported he had, that you'd now build out from those issues. And he said to me, look, when we were talking about the euro, you said I was a single-issue politician. When I broadened it out to talk about something else, you said I'm a two-issue politician. Now you charge me with being a four-issue politician. Soon it'll be only a six-issue politician. The truth is they reject this idea, Diana, that it's going for the core vote. He believes that on issues like law and order, they're reaching way beyond the core vote to the sort of people who voted for Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, who believe that the Labour Party's let them down. They know that they've got to talk about more mainstream issues like health and education, the social agenda too, but they believe they're making real headway on this.
Nick Robinson, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining us now, the Conservative MP Eric Forth, Labour's Barbara Follett, and the Liberal Democrat Home Affairs spokesman Simon Hughes. So Simon Hughes, I suppose attitudes like yours are failing the criminal justice system, according to William Hague.
Well, firstly, it's Conservatives have been in power for most of the last 40 years since the last war, so if the Liberal establishment is to blame, I have to say I wish we had been part of it, but we hadn't.
But there is an argument that people are far too understanding of the criminal and not understanding enough of the victim of crime.
Let me deal with that. I also think that the victim needs to be recognised more. I have always said, I used to practice as a lawyer, I've always said the victim doesn't get a say in the system nearly enough.
So the criminal justice system does let them down in a way?
It does often let victims down.
And so William Hague has a point.
Well, there's a point, but then he comes to wrong conclusions and very hasty conclusions, just very quickly. He came to the conclusion that people ought to be able to take the law into their own hands. That was the implication of his response to the Martin case. A very dangerous conclusion to come to. And from the party that argues for mandatory sentences, he suddenly started suggesting that in these sorts of cases there shouldn't be a mandatory sentence. He came to the conclusion the other day that we ought to have double jeopardy removed. There are two people reporting on that, the Home Affairs Select Committee, the Law Commission. You really ought to seek advice and wait for it. And lastly, he now has said that we've got to have many more cases where the sentences can be appealed because they're too lenient. I have to say, if there's going to be no certainty about sentence, no certainty about conviction, the criminal justice system is going to be in complete turmoil.
So Eric Forth, it's rather confused and you're playing to the emotions of the Tory heartlands then.
Well, it's that sort of waffle that's got that makes William's argument. And I think the fact that people now are reacting to what William Hague is saying much more than they did even a year or two ago suggests that William is now hitting the right buttons, striking a chord on a common sense basis with more and more people out there.
But
that's what's getting at the politicians, and I'm delighted to hear it.
But is it fair to say that liberal do-gooders have actually done more harm than good to the criminal justice system? And that is the point that is being made.
And ordinary people understand that. I, along with I'm sure all the other MPs, constantly get letters in my post bag from people who are complaining that the police seem to be focusing on the wrong things, that the judicial system seems to be more interested in punishing the relatively innocent rather than the obviously guilty. This is a feeling that's out there, and what William Hague is doing and why he's been successful is that he's reflecting that feeling. He isn't initiating it, he isn't stoking it up, he's simply articulating it, and that's what people desperately want.
So if Labour want the votes, they've got to be tougher on crime.
Labour is already very tough on crime. If William Hague really wants to tackle crime, he should have voted with us in June '97 to ban handguns. We could have otherwise had a United States kind of situation here. The causes of crime are guns, the causes of crime are drugs, and to a certain extent it's poverty. And it's not liberal to say that, it's hard-hitting and difficult. And he was a member of that complacent establishment that he's deriding.
But today he seems to be striking a chord with the police force. When he is talking to the Police Federation, they are the ones that are cheering him. They didn't cheer Jack Straw yesterday. So somewhere along the line, he is being able to exploit this particular issue to the Conservative
Can I say it's easier to cheer simplistic statements rather than to deal with the hard and difficult facts of reality?
Well, this is the point, Simon Hughes, that he is able to stir it up. He is able to get the votes. And this is something that's going to be played out in the run-up to the general election.
Well, if I may say so, I was at the Police Federation and spoke to them on Tuesday. I didn't get booed off the stage. I made a proposition, some of which were warmly applauded. I was told it was a speech that they were happy with because it made some fairly obvious points. Firstly, people want crime to be prevented. We've done very badly. Crime has doubled, including over the period when the Tories were in power. Secondly, they want crime to be detected. 3 out of 100 crimes end up in a conviction. Now, that's why police numbers matter, because not a single person in Britain believes that if you have fewer police, you're likely to be more successful. And again, it is the Tories, not before 92. Eric would be right to say up to 92 police numbers went up, but for the last 10 years, police numbers have gone down. So there are some things we ought to concentrate on, and the criminal justice system has a role, but it's not the central issue. It's deterring the crime and catching the people who do it. And then, if I may say so, when people come out of prison, not letting 4 out of 5 of them within 2 years go back into the system, which we terribly badly fail with at the moment.
So, Barbara Phillip, what 2 or 3 things that Jack Straw's doing at the moment is going to make all the difference to change that opinion from supporting the Conservatives to supporting Labour?
I'm not so concerned about what happens electorally. I'm concerned about what we do about crime. And the things we have to do are tackle those causes of crime. We have done one on handguns. We have to look at what is happening with young offenders. William Hague talked about
But you've got to do something about it as well. You can't just talk about it. It's got to make a difference to the lives of people in the country.
He is reforming the probationary service, a lot of which has happened in my constituency and has made a real difference because we are bringing these young offenders to book. But we aren't necessarily putting them into prison because, as you know, prisons are places where more crime is engendered. They're breeding grounds for crime, and his proposals, which is the third thing, his proposals for changing prison sentencing, I think could have a very positive effect on crime.
Well, I'll tell you why I think William went down well with the police. I think the police feel that they're being systematically undermined these days, whether it's relatively small things locally or whether it's something big like the McPherson report, where they were accused as a group of being institutionally racist. If we accused any other group of people indiscriminately like that, we'd probably be put in prison. But apparently the government or the government's agents can accuse the police on that basis and think they can get away with it. Well, they haven't got away with it. And what's happened now is that the police, I think, quite understandably, are feeling beleaguered, unsupported, and no wonder they can't do their job properly. And what William has put his finger on is that the police need support at every level if we want them to do their difficult and dangerous job and do it effectively.
But why didn't the previous government give it to them then? Because they didn't. The Conservative government did not give it to them. And in fact, one of the organisations that was so deeply dissatisfied just before 97 were the police.
Indeed. Well, we're learning the lessons. This is what being in opposition is
Yes,
about.
but talk is cheap, Eric.
We've just stumbled on it. It's taken us maybe 3 years, but I've now realised, William realised a way ahead of me,
But
that what we
18
do...
years in government and 3 years in
I'm not going to
opposition.
defend 18 years in government. We did some wonderful things. We did some very poor things. And if William Hague is now saying that he recognises what we have to do, he is now giving a lead, he is stating these matters clearly, he is getting support.
But it's
I
not
think that's
what you
wonderful.
say, it's what you do, and that's what he'll be counted on.
Thank you very much indeed, all of you. We'll move on. Earlier in the Commons, the Chancellor Gordon Brown went head-to-head with his opposite number, Michael Portillo, at Treasury questions over public spending.
But how can the Chancellor be so very self-satisfied and puffed up when public services have got worse under him? Class sizes have gone up. Police numbers have gone down by 2,300. There are 100 vital road improvements which have been cancelled, even though the road position in this country is the worst for 20 years, and there are an extra 250,000 people waiting to see a consultant. Why doesn't the Chancellor talk about services delivered rather than what he's promised for the future? And since the question concerns what representations he's received, could he please confide in the House and tell us what his attitude will be to any representations that come from the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland?
The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and the whole Cabinet have been arguing the case in every region, in every region of the country. What the Shadow Chancellor should face up to is that in his call for extra spending today on transport, on crime, on health, on education, which is exactly what he is implying by the statement he is making, he is driving a coach and horses through the politically driven tax guarantee that he says that he supports. And I don't think people are going to listen to a Shadow Chancellor who at one and the same time was responsible for some of the biggest tax rises this country has ever seen, who introduced VAT on fuel, who raised national insurance, who introduced the airports tax, who introduced the escalator on fuel and put them through the House of Commons, and at the same time said then that he wanted to cut public spending. I don't think people are going to listen to a Shadow Chancellor who says that he now wants to raise public spending.
You could never look me in the eye when he answers one of my questions. I wonder why it is that the Chancellor of the Exchequer finds it so difficult to maintain eye contact. Could it be because after 3 years of non-delivery, Labour voters in Labour heartlands know that he has let them down? Could it be because they know that he's wasted £7 billion on fraud, which has been identified by his honourable friend, the member for Birkenhead? And how does the Chancellor of the Exchequer respond to the criticisms that have been made by the British Medical Association, saying that the government has not focused on what's important for the National Health Service, but has become preoccupied with totally artificial indicators? Isn't the message from the local elections, and won't the Chancellor of the Exchequer take some personal responsibility